They are remembered in Scripture as the enemies of Israel, the adversaries of Samson, the oppressors of Saul, and the people from whose ranks came Goliath, the giant defeated by David. For centuries, the word Philistine has carried with it a weight of hostility, even insult, used to describe someone uncultured or brutish. But behind the biblical stories and the centuries of negative connotation lies the true history of an ancient Mediterranean people, a civilization that once flourished along the coastal plains of Canaan. Their story is one of migration, survival, rivalry, and ultimate disappearance, leaving behind fragments of pottery, ruined cities, and a legacy that has been shaped more by their enemies than by their own voices. To uncover who the Philistines really were is to step into the shifting world of the late Bronze Age and the dawn of the Iron Age, a period of upheaval when great empires crumbled, new peoples surged across the seas, and ancient cultures collided in ways that would change history forever. The story begins in mystery. Ancient Egyptian inscriptions from the reign of Pharaoh Ramses III speak of a confederation of foreign invaders known as the Sea Peoples, who arrived from distant lands across the Mediterranean. They came in waves, raiding, plundering, and settling along the coasts of the Levant. Among these peoples, the Egyptians identified a group they called the Peliset, a name scholars connect with the Philistines. The origins of the Peliset remain debated. Some trace them to the Aegean world, perhaps from Mycenaean Greece or Crete. Others suggest Anatolia or Cyprus. Wherever they came from, they carried with them cultural traits that seemed foreign to the land of Canaan. Distinctive pottery styles, new weaponry, and architectural forms that set them apart from their Semitic neighbors. They were not merely raiders but migrants, people in search of new homes at a time when the old Mediterranean powers were collapsing. The Egyptians managed to repel the Sea People's invasion, at least within their own borders. Ramses III carved the story of his triumph onto the walls of his temple at Medinet Habu, showing chaotic battle scenes of ships clashing, archers firing, and warriors with feathered headdresses being defeated. Yet though defeated by Egypt, the Philistines did not vanish. Instead, they settled just to the north on the southern coastal plain of Canaan. There they established 5 major city-states: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. These cities, known collectively as the Philistine Pentapolis, became the heart of their civilization. From these centers, the Philistines thrived, trading across the seas, farming the fertile plains and building a culture that would endure for centuries. To their neighbors, especially the Israelites, the Philistines became both a constant threat and an inescapable presence. The biblical narratives remember them as powerful warriors with iron weapons, formidable chariots, and towering champions. Yet they were more than just enemies in battle. They were a people who brought new ideas, technologies, and artistic styles into the region. Their pottery, known as Philistine Bishromeware, bore bold red and black designs that echoed Aegean patterns. Their temples and shrines show hints of foreign religious practices blended with local traditions. The Philistines were not outsiders for long. They adapted to the land of Canaan, interacting with local peoples, but they never lost their distinct identity. This identity, forged in the crucible of migration and survival, gave them both strength and cohesion in a land where many peoples competed for power. Archaeology has provided some of the clearest glimpses into their world. Excavations at Ashkelon have uncovered not only monumental city walls and gates, but also one of the first Philistine cemeteries ever found, revealing burial customs and even genetic clues to their origins. At Gath, the supposed hometown of Goliath, archaeologists unearthed massive fortifications and evidence of a thriving urban center that dwarfed many contemporary cities. Pottery shards, food remains, and inscriptions speak of a people with a vibrant daily life, farming grains, raising livestock, brewing beer, and trading goods with neighbors near and far. Through these findings, the Philistines emerge not as shadowy villains of Scripture, but as a complex, sophisticated society caught between the great powers of Egypt, Assyria, and later Babylon, yet forging a legacy of their own. The Philistines' story cannot be told without placing them within the wider transformation of the Late Bronze to Early Iron Age. This was a period of collapse, when the mighty empires that had once dominated the eastern Mediterranean faltered under waves of crisis. The Hittite Empire of Anatolia disintegrated. Egypt fought desperately to hold on to its territories. Trade networks that had once tied together Greece, Cyprus, Canaan, and Mesopotamia began to unravel. Into this world of dislocation came migrants and raiders from the sea. The Philistines were among them, and their arrival along the coast of Canaan reshaped the political map of the region. Their 5 cities, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, were not merely isolated settlements. Together they formed a kind of confederation, each with its own ruler yet bound together in alliance. This pentapolis gave them strength. It provided a network of fortified centers from which they could control farmland, trade routes, and harbors. Gaza and Ashkelon connected them to Egypt and the broader Mediterranean. Ashdod commanded inland routes, while Ekron became famous in later times for its olive oil production, exporting vast quantities across the region. Gath, situated inland, served as a bulwark against Israelite incursions. Archaeological evidence shows these cities were large and well-developed, with fortifications that rivaled those of great powers. Their urban planning reveals a society that valued defense, but also thrived on commerce and craftsmanship. Life within these cities must have been vibrant. Markets bustled with goods from near and far. Potters shaped distinctive vessels that carried food and drink to households and sanctuaries alike. Their Bachrome pottery, with its red and black designs painted over a white background, shows motifs reminiscent of the Aegean world: birds, fish, and geometric patterns. The Philistines were skilled artisans, and their cultural fingerprints spread through the Levant. They brewed beer, an unusual trait compared to their wine-loving neighbors, and they introduced new cooking styles, as seen in the hearths and cooking jugs uncovered in excavations. Their diet was rich in grains, meat, and dairy, reflecting both abundance and adaptation to their new homeland. Religion among the Philistines was complex and appears to have blended old traditions from their ancestral homelands with the gods of Canaan. Temples discovered at sites like Tel Kasil reveal layouts that were distinctive, with long halls leading to central sanctuaries. The Bible names Philistine deities such as Dagon, often associated with grain or fertility, and cult objects found in excavations suggest the presence of other gods as well. The Philistines, like their neighbors, lived in a deeply religious world, one where war, fertility, and survival were bound to the favor of divine powers. Conflict with Israel quickly became a defining theme of their history. The Philistines, established along the coast, inevitably clashed with the tribes of Israel settling in the central highlands. The biblical accounts portray these conflicts in vivid detail. The story of Samson tells of a lone warrior who struggled against Philistine dominance, his feats both legendary and tragic. Whether historical or mythologized, such stories reflect the very real tension between the two peoples. Later, the rise of Saul as the first king of Israel is framed largely as a response to the Philistine threat. The battles that follow, including the famous duel between David and Goliath, illustrate how the Philistines loomed large in Israelite memory. Goliath, the champion from Gath, symbolizes Philistine might. A warrior armed with weapons of iron and clad in heavy armor. To Israel, defeating such a foe was not just a military victory, but a divine triumph. Yet the wars between Israel and the Philistines were not one-sided. For much of the early Iron Age, the Philistines often held the upper hand. They controlled ironworking technology, giving them superior weapons. Their chariots dominated the plains. In battle, their organization and resources allowed them to field powerful armies. It was only with the rise of David and the unification of Israel under his leadership that the Philistines were decisively checked. Still, even then, they remained a persistent force, part of the political and cultural landscape of the region for centuries. Beyond Israel, the Philistines interacted with other great powers. Egypt, once their adversary, eventually dealt with them as neighbors and trading partners. Assyria later saw them as subjects to be conquered and taxed. In inscriptions from Assyrian kings, the names of Philistine cities appear alongside lists of other subjugated peoples. This tells us that while the Philistines were significant, they were not invincible. They were woven into the larger fabric of Near Eastern politics, sometimes allies, sometimes foes, but always present. Archaeology has been crucial in separating myth from history. In Ashkelon, excavators uncovered a Philistine cemetery, the first of its kind, shedding light on their burial practices. Unlike the Israelites, who practiced burial in caves or family tombs, the Philistines laid their dead in pits or cists, sometimes with personal belongings. The bones revealed diet, health, and even signs of trauma from conflict. DNA extracted from some remains suggested links to populations from southern Europe, supporting the idea that the Philistines were part of the wider migrations of the Sea Peoples. At Gath, archaeologists discovered the largest known city gate of the Iron Age, testifying to the city's scale and power. Inscriptions, though rare, offer tantalizing glimpses into their language, which appears to have been Indo-European in origin before eventually giving way to Semitic tongues under cultural assimilation. These findings show us that the Philistines were not a shadowy, marginal people. They were dynamic, adaptive, and influential. They built cities that lasted centuries. They fought, traded, and worshipped with passion and resilience. They contributed to the cultural mosaic of the ancient Near East, even as their story was told largely through the eyes of their enemies. The Philistines reached the height of their power in the early Iron Age, their cities prospering as fortified hubs of trade and agriculture. The fertile plains of the southern coast gave them abundant harvests, while their position along the Mediterranean made them natural intermediaries in commerce. Olive oil from Ekron became especially renowned, produced on an industrial scale. Archaeologists have uncovered massive oil presses at the site, suggesting that this city was one of the largest producers of olive oil in the ancient world. Amphorae filled with oil would have been shipped across the seas, traded to Egypt, Phoenicia, and perhaps even farther into the Mediterranean. This economic strength allowed the Philistines to maintain powerful armies and resist their rivals for centuries. But prosperity did not mean peace. Their long conflict with Israel remained central, flaring again and again as the balance of power shifted. The Philistines were not merely antagonists in the biblical narrative. They were often the stronger party. Israelite leaders rose and fell in response to them. Saul, the first king of Israel, fought desperately to hold them back. Yet the Battle of Mount Gilboa ended in disaster when Saul and his sons were slain. The Philistines displayed the fallen king's body in their temples, a chilling symbol of their dominance. It was only through David, who united the tribes and forged a new monarchy, that the Israelites began to turn the tide. David's capture of Jerusalem and his campaigns against the Philistines marked a shift. But even then, they remained a formidable presence on Israel's borders. Beyond Israel, the Philistines were drawn into the orbit of greater empires. The Assyrians, expanding westward in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, sought to dominate the Levantine coast. For Assyria, the Philistine cities were both strategic prizes and rebellious vassals. Kings like Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II boasted of campaigns against Philistine rulers who resisted tribute. In the annals of Sargon II, one reads of the conquest of Ashdod and the punishment of its king for defiance. Yet despite these conquests, the Philistine cities were resilient. Time and again, they rebuilt, their walls rising from the rubble, their markets bustling once more. Their wealth and coastal connections made them too valuable to erase completely, even for an empire as ruthless as Assyria. Still, the pressure of empire took its toll. Assyrian domination curtailed their independence, forcing their kings into the role of client rulers. Heavy tribute drained their resources, while Assyrian garrisons curtailed their freedom. The Philistines' distinctiveness, once so pronounced, began to blur under foreign rule. Their language faded, replaced by Aramaic and Hebrew. Their gods were overshadowed by the Assyrian pantheon. Cultural assimilation advanced with every passing generation. The Philistines, once conquerors and migrants themselves, were slowly absorbed into the larger tapestry of the Near East. Their final act came under the Babylonians. In the early 6th century BCE, Nebuchadnezzar II unleashed devastating campaigns across the Levant. Cities that had stood for centuries fell to his armies. Ashkelon was destroyed in 604 BCE, its people deported into exile. Gaza, too, suffered under Babylonian might. By the time Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns were complete, the Philistines, as a distinct people, had disappeared from history. Their cities lived on, inhabited by new populations, but the identity that had once bound them together was gone. The Pentapolis, once symbols of resilience and power, became provincial towns in vast imperial systems. The biblical authors, writing during and after these events, looked back on the Philistines as the great adversaries of their early history. To them, the disappearance of the Philistines was a kind of divine vindication. Prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel spoke of their downfall as judgment. To the Israelites, the Philistines were remembered less for their culture than for their opposition, their identity shaped entirely through conflict. Over time, the name Philistine became shorthand for barbarism and opposition to the chosen people of God. The real story of migrants forging a new home, of cities thriving on trade, and craftsmanship of a people adapting and enduring for centuries, was lost beneath layers of memory shaped by war and religion. For centuries after, the Philistines lingered only as a shadow. Historians knew them mostly through scripture, often dismissed as myth or as little more than caricatures of hostility. It was only with the rise of modern archaeology that their true story began to emerge. Excavations in the 19th and 20th centuries gradually revealed the ruins of their cities. Pottery styles, unlike those of their neighbors, confirmed they had once been a distinct culture. Inscriptions and temple remains gave hints of their beliefs. Skeletal remains at last provided biological evidence of their origins. Step by step, the Philistines re-emerged from the dust, not as faceless villains but as a complex civilization whose fate was tied to the great upheavals of the ancient world. Today, the Philistines are no longer remembered only as the enemies of Israel. They are recognized as part of the wider phenomenon of the Sea Peoples, whose migrations reshaped the Mediterranean at the end of the Bronze Age. They are seen as contributors to the cultural and economic networks of the Levant, not just as destroyers, but as builders and traders. The ruins of Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gaza, Ekron, and Gath stand as testaments to their resilience. Their legacy lives not in their own writings, for none survive, but in the stones they left behind, in the DNA preserved in ancient bones, and in the echoes of their name across history. The rediscovery of the Philistines in modern times has not been a simple process. For much of history they were little more than a name, remembered through biblical accounts and scattered references in Assyrian inscriptions. Their own voices were silent. Unlike the Egyptians, the Hittites, or the Babylonians, the Philistines left behind no vast archives of texts or monumental inscriptions. Their memory survived mainly through those who fought them, and that memory was hostile. Yet archaeology has gradually given them back their story. At Ashkelon, one of the most important sites, decades of excavation uncovered layer upon layer of occupation. Beneath the sands lay evidence of a thriving coastal city with connections stretching across the Mediterranean. The discovery of a Philistine cemetery there was a turning point. For the first time, scholars could examine how the Philistines buried their dead, what objects they placed in graves, and even extract genetic evidence of their ancestry. DNA analysis revealed traces of European ancestry in the earliest burials, a strong indication that the Philistines were indeed part of the Sea Peoples' migration from the Aegean or surrounding regions. Yet, within a few generations, their genetic profile blended with the local population, showing that they quickly intermarried and integrated into Canaanite society. This balance between foreign origin and local adaptation explains much about who they were, outsiders who became insiders, distinct yet deeply rooted in the land they had claimed. Archaeology confirms what history hints. The Philistines were not simply invaders, but settlers who carved out a place in a world already teeming with ancient peoples. Other sites have told their stories in different ways. At Gath, massive fortifications revealed a city of extraordinary size and power. The remains of houses, workshops, and temples testify to a bustling urban center. A shard inscribed with names similar to Goliath tantalizingly suggests a connection between the biblical tale and real people who once lived there. At Ekron, industrial installations for producing olive oil highlight the economic strength of the Philistine world, proving that they were not only warriors, but also masterful producers and traders. Ashdod and Gaza, though less fully excavated due to modern challenges, still yield artifacts that link them to the wider Philistine culture. Piece by piece, the picture grows clearer. The Philistines were a dynamic, resilient, and adaptable people who left a deep imprint on the land they inhabited. Understanding the Philistines also means reconsidering the world of the Bible. The narratives of Samson, Saul, David, and Goliath are infused with memory of real struggles, yet they are also shaped by theological interpretation. To the biblical authors, the Philistines symbolized chaos, threat, and the testing of Israel's faith. But seen through the lens of archaeology, the Philistines were not demons but humans, migrants, artisans, farmers, rulers, and worshippers. Their clashes with Israel reflect the struggles of neighboring peoples for survival and dominance, not a cosmic battle between good and evil. Recognizing this restores balance to the story and gives the Philistines a voice they long lacked. The disappearance of the Philistines under Babylonian conquest did not erase them completely. Their cities lived on, often inhabited by new peoples, their names preserved through centuries. Gaza remains a city of importance even today, its history stretching back to the Philistines and beyond. The memory of Gath, Ashkelon, and Ashdod lingers in ruins and texts. The very word Palestine, used in later eras by the Greeks and Romans to describe the broader region, derives ultimately from the name of the Philistines. Though their identity as a people vanished, their name endured, reshaped and repurposed through history. Reflecting on the Philistines invites a broader lesson about how civilizations are remembered. They were remembered not through their own achievements, but through the lens of their enemies. Their reputation as uncultured or brutish lasted for millennia, yet archaeology has overturned this view. Far from being mere barbarians, the Philistines were carriers of Mediterranean traditions, participants in global trade, and builders of complex societies. Their story reminds us how history can be distorted by the voices that survive, and how vital it is to recover the perspectives of the forgotten. Today, scholars continue to piece together their legacy. Each excavation, each artifact, each inscription adds another layer to the mosaic of who they were. The Philistines emerge not only as adversaries in an ancient rivalry, but as human beings navigating the challenges of a turbulent age. Their migration reflects the broader upheavals of the late Bronze Age collapse. Their adaptation shows the resilience of displaced peoples in forging new identities. Their conflicts illustrate the realities of survival in a land where power was always contested, and their disappearance demonstrates the fragility of cultural distinctiveness in the face of imperial conquest. The story of the Philistines, then, is more than a tale of a vanished people. It is part of the great human drama of the ancient Mediterranean, where civilizations rose and fell, identities were forged and lost, and legacies endured in ways their creators could never have imagined. The Philistines remind us that behind every biblical enemy, every name carved on a victory stele and every ruin in the earth, there was once a people, with hopes, fears, families, and dreams, whose story deserves to be told. From their mysterious origins as migrants across the sea to their flourishing cities on the coast of Canaan, to their centuries of conflict and eventual disappearance, the Philistines stand as one of the most intriguing civilizations of the ancient Near East. For too long they were defined by others. Now, through the combined voices of archaeology, history, and science, they're finally beginning to speak for themselves. Their history is not simply that of Israel's foe, but of a Mediterranean people who carved out a chapter in the human story only to be forgotten until now.